Today on The State of Us, after the Wagner Group's mutiny showed the unexpected fragility of President Vladimir Putin's regime, key questions remain unanswered. It's only been a few days since Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin withdrew his support forces from their advance on Moscow, halting an armed insurrection that brought Russia to the brink of a full-blown clash between its military and the private army, according to the latest report from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, our friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Well, this is an ever-moving topic, but we just felt it was one that we need to get on the air and talk about a little bit, because it's one of those things where, is this a chink in Putin's armor? Or is he playing this to become even stronger? As we go on the air, none of the top officials who are involved in this have been seen for the last 24 hours on any kind of media or outlet. So what is going on? But it does show that maybe there are those within Russia that don't like the war with Ukraine or do not like the direction that Putin is taking the country. And then also, very importantly, as I was discussing with our intern before the show, it sounds good that Putin's having trouble and that Russia may be in chaos, but is that really a good thing? And you say, well, what are you talking about? Stay tuned. We'll talk about that. But you think about it, a major world player having problems will have, if not an outright effect, a very much of a ripple effect on the world economy, which could influence or affect those of us living in the United States as well. So what can be good can end up bad as well. So this is a situation I think that we really need to watch and pay attention to.
So a little bit of background for anybody who's not, fully caught up here. And to Lance's point, this is an evolving situation. So we're sharing with you the most up-to-date information that we have at the time that we're doing the show. But the New York Times reported that President Vladimir Putin on Saturday vowed to put down an armed mutiny by a private military company that crossed from Ukraine into southern Russia virtually unimpeded, seized critical military and civilian facilities, and declared its intention to head north to Moscow. Now, the development since then is that supposedly, and the details are murky, Belarus was able to broker sort of an agreement between these two that granted amnesty to the troops and to Wagner's leader so that they could basically, I guess, just sort of get off the hook for all this and harm, no foul.
That's what the agreement, that Prigozhin would not be punished, because on Saturday morning, Putin had called Prigozhin a traitor to the Russian people and the Russian country, to the country
and
of
now
Russia.
Amnesty.
And now all of a sudden, we're just going to let him go. That doesn't sound like a former KGB agent to me, that Putin would let this die like that. But at the same time, we're all guessing right now, but I feel like Prigozhin maybe thought, hey, I might be strong enough to become the leader of Russia, but I can't do it without some help. So he started this push with his paramilitary group that he has, Wagner, who are made up of ex-cons.
And they've been doing work for Russia for years, right? All over the world.
And basically,
because some people might be like, who is this group? I mean, what the heck? Where did they come from?
They fought in Syria and in Africa.
And they get a lot of the credit for the advances made in Ukraine so far,
right,
in the places that Russia's actually been successful.
But with very high casualty rates. But Prigozhin went to the prisons and recruited prisoners to do his fighting for him, all with the blessing of Putin. Putin basically, when you read the history, made Prigozhin. Prigozhin was, a small time, big time racketeer criminal element who Putin kind of looked over, and Prigozhin's nickname is the chef because he was got a lot of contracts to cater events at the Kremlin. So Putin kind of made this animal, and now this animal looking like he maybe wanted to fight back a little bit. But as he moved north out of southern Russia, there weren't a lot of people that came and jumped on his bandwagon. And so it was kind of looks like he got cold feet when he realized he knows maybe Prigozhin feels he can't take Putin down by himself. And when other people didn't jump on the bandwagon, he was willing to cut a deal. But can you imagine being Putin and the person you fed is now going to try to bite your hand off? I mean, I can't imagine with either one of these two individuals that they're going to let this go without something going down between the two of them.
Well, on the other side, right, is that also, at least as of right now, Prigozhin was last seen Saturday, but we haven't seen publicly, at least in a live capacity, Putin or Russian defense minister either.
That's what I said, it's like,
well, because there was a video, a video posted of Putin and the Russian defense minister, but both were
undated. Without, right. I mean, you've got the whole,
they weren't live.
And TASS, the national news agency for Russia, is still claiming that Prigozhin is a traitor.
Right. Well, that he's still under investigation for inciting rebellion, even though then the deal is supposedly that he has amnesty.
So what's true? I mean, once again, when you have a state-controlled news media, what is the truth? What is going on? And we on the outside really don't know what's going on.
Well, even a lot of the people on the inside probably don't know exactly what's going on.
But
either.
What does it say about Putin and Putin's control of power? I mean, to me, it makes it, are there going to be other attacks now? Is word leaking out among the Russian people that the war is not going the way state news media is saying it's going? I mean, why else would one of the most colorful, decorated fighting arms of the Russian Republic turn against its leader?
Well, one of Russia's generals who previously led the Southern Russian Republic said he was in an interview with Mr. Prigozhin, and he asked him several questions, and one of them was whether or not Mr. Prigozhin saw the actions that he was taking as justified. And he replied with, "They're absolutely correct. We are saving Russia." He felt like the defense minister had been, quote, throwing them, referring to his troops, into a meat grinder in Ukraine without, quote, any ammunition, any thought, or any plans.
And that is stipulated in the article as well. A couple different places. Prigozhin asked the defense minister for weapons and didn't get any and started bad-mouthing him, who was also a hand-picked Putin protege. And then all of a sudden he got some weapons. He said, well, everything's good. Then he complained again and got some more and was able to claim victory, but with very high casualty rates. So then it becomes, well, I gave you the weapons, but look at how many men you lost. And he's like, well, I wouldn't have lost so many men if you had given me the weapons that I asked for when I started the invasion. And if you're Putin, it's like, okay, I've got these two guys fighting themselves, so they're not going to fight me. But then all of a sudden one of them says, you know what? I'm upset with you and I'm going to come after you. That's kind of what this game looks like to me is going on. And then the real outlier here that I think we need to discuss is who's in control of the nuclear weapons in Russia. I mean, this is, a 3 decades old fear, according to the Wall Street Journal, over the custody of nuclear weapons that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in 1991, Russia had almost 30,000 deployed and stored weapons in its nuclear stockpile, more than 6 times what it has today. Today it has about 5,000. That upheaval spurred Washington to develop a program to help Russia and other states spawned by the Soviet Union's collapse to consolidate and secure their potentially vulnerable arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear or otherwise, to keep them from being stolen or misused. So when Putin took over 30 years ago, this was a big concern because the breakaway republics started their own countries and their own system of governments, but they had stockpiles of nuclear weapons from the old Soviet
Union. Slowly over time,
Union.
That's been cleaned up. Ukraine was an example of one that actually held a lot of the arsenal and ultimately got rid of all of its nukes, in part with promises from Russia and the United States and brokering that Russia would never, do what it's exactly doing right now. But the point is, so they still
now
have
there's 5,000 nuclear weapons across Russia. Who controls them? Or who will follow whose orders to control them?
Well, and what condition are the facilities and weapons in? Because the other thing is, it was just a few months ago, right, that we covered that there was it's called the New START Treaty between the United States and Russia, which specifically deals with the proliferation and de-escalation of long-range strategic nuclear weapons, which Russia has withdrawn from now. So we don't even know because the inspections aren't happening. We don't have eyes on all of these. We have our intelligence sources, and of course we're keeping tabs that way. But from the public perspective, we really don't have the same level of access. None of the United Nations, nobody does, that we did even just a year ago. So I think too, there's that question of, well, that's the information that we last had available to us about who, where, how powerful,
where everything was,
how they're protected, what condition they're in. Because the other thing is not necessarily the fear that they have more, right? But how safe is what they have? So that's part of what we're going to talk about too. That's sort of the theme of today's show, right? Of key questions remain unanswered. And what does this tell us about the future fight in Ukraine as well? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The news analysis in the New York Times, which I thought had a very apt title, Putin has long embraced chaos, and now it is enveloping him. So this is, of course, sort of an opinion piece. That's what their news analysis pieces are. But the question that Lance left us with in the last segment was, has this been another misjudgment by Putin? In other words, not allowing... Because there was intention to allow the defense minister and Mr. Prigozhin to, basically
to feud publicly,
right? And Putin's been okay with that. He's had plenty of.
Well,
other
it takes
people
pressure off of him,
right?
Because then all of a sudden he's not, getting the blame for fighting the war.
Right.
It's one of his main armies, private armies fighting on the ground, is complaining that the defense minister isn't providing weapons. And the defense minister says, you got all the weapons you need. So now who's in the news? Well, these two guys, and Putin's sitting up there saying, hey, I started the war and gave you guys everything you needed to win. I can't help it if you two are inept and can't get it done, right? He stays out of the fray, and Putin looks good, and everybody starts to point blame at the defense minister and Prigozhin.
And then the question is, though, has that sort of has it divulged out of Putin's hands? This part of it's probably not something that he wanted.
Yeah, I don't think he wanted to see the paramilitary group in tanks.
Right. Headed Moscow.
With tanks headed towards Moscow.
Yeah.
Right.
Probably not what his intention was.
Well, to the point that they started to barricade the city.
Right.
He can't go back and say, well, this really wasn't a real thing, because he sent word out on Saturday morning to the Russian people, we need to prepare for an invasion. So he can't claim that, well, this really wasn't as bad as we thought it was. I guess he can claim it. He can do whatever he wants. But when you go to call up your defenses, you think there's a possibility that they might come through.
I think part of what it comes down to is there's this calculation by Putin, right? That if he maintains the person that everybody has to report back to and that nobody can stand up to, then you maintain control. However, and that's part of what we talked about pre-show, right? Once somebody does something like this, even if they're not, and I also want to talk about, I wrote this down, was it successful? It's easy to say, well, this failed, coup. Okay, well, was it failed? I mean,
is it over?
Is it over? My understanding, right, is that, and again, somebody out there, if you have a better understanding, happy to, but Wagner was upset about supplies, access, how his troops are being treated, how he's being treated. He's upset about those things. He's not getting any answer.
Prigozhin is. Wagner's the group that he runs.
Yes, the group that Prigozhin is running, Wagner, they're frustrated. So Prigozhin decides we're going to take these steps. We take these steps. And now, for having marched on the capital of Russia, you're getting a deal that lets you go to another country free and clear, off the hook with you and your men. I mean, I guess you could say they didn't win, but they're not in Ukraine anymore and they're getting to go to another country and they're not going to get punished supposedly. Right. Yeah. Well, that's the whole, we still haven't seen or heard from any of these people. So
mysteriously, in 6 months they're gone.
Right. Yeah.
But does it show a chink in the armor of Putin? Because there are a lot of other people now that might say, hey, Prigozhin took a shot at him. Maybe if we organize it a little bit better and 4 or 5 of us get together, we might be able to take out Putin and take out the government, because this war in Ukraine is really hurting our bottom line. We're not making money. We're not making as much money as we used to. Maybe it's time to change. Putin's been in there, 23 years, since 1999. It's time for a change. Maybe we're the ones to make the change. Has the whole Wagner situation with Prigozhin maybe emboldened other people within Russia to now say, it's time for us to organize. So while it looks like Prigozhin has been stopped and set aside and dealt with, but does this then make others interested in taking on Putin in a different way or from another angle? We haven't even talked about it. How does this play out with Ukraine? I mean, you still have the war in Ukraine who's being fought. And as you've said, the Russian people don't get a lot of the straight scoop that's going on. Well, obviously now they're getting a different story than they used to. It's going to start the rumor mills going in Russia. Will there be the continued support that Putin has had to fight this war when these soldiers who are a part of Wagner go back and start talking to their families, text with their families, whatever? Is word going to start to filter out? How powerful will social media be in getting the word out to the Russian people? And all of a sudden, wait a minute, the government's saying this, and my social media feeds from my family members who are part of Wagner is saying this. And, what can Zelensky do to play this up? Because, not to open up another can of worms, but Ukraine's still looking to get in to NATO. So, I mean, there's a lot of things at play here other than, this guy tried something in 48 hours. It was, everybody washed their hands of it and threw it away. And now it's back to business as usual. I don't really think it is. I think do we know where it's going to go? No, but it's going to go somewhere. It's not over and done with.
Well, and historically,
I think Putin wants it to be, but I don't think it is.
Or he'd prefer that people think that it is, right? But historically, this group has been sort of the fallback option for Putin when forces aren't what he needs them to be, or they're not having success in parts of the world.
Ukraine in the first place?
Right. The whole reason they went is because the traditional military was, struggling pretty badly. And really the only places they made substantive gains are places that, the Wagner Group, worked or were basically taking the lead in, or just totally doing it themselves. So I think there's also there's the whole other side of the question of, regardless of what's going on internally, turmoil in Russia, what happens by taking this group out of the fighting altogether? I mean, because it sounds like, if the deal stuff that's supposed to happen goes through, a lot of these guys they're done in Ukraine.
The Wagner Group is going to dissipate.
Right.
And if this was the main group that was being successful in the fight in Ukraine,
yeah,
what does that lead Putin to do?
Well, and to your point too, though, of what, if you're Ukraine and this has happened, what openings are there now to try to take advantage of? Is this the right time to make certain moves? Because we know
what's
that
NATO going to let them do?
Right.
Because Ukraine's only as powerful as the weapons they get from NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And there's fear.
NATO has an upcoming summit on July 11th.
Right. But there's also fear, led by the United States, of upheaval in Russia. We want the war to stop in Ukraine, but we don't want to antagonize Putin to the point that he might do something stupid.
We've talked about that philosophy so much.
That's been the storyline, correct?
I know. No.
Since the war started a year ago, February, that's been the storyline from the United States, because I know we seem to be jumping around, but there's just a lot of things here, folks. In 2008, the United States supported wholeheartedly Ukraine's entrance into NATO. And now, in this upcoming meeting in July 11th, according to the NATO leaders, the people putting the brakes on Ukraine getting into NATO are the United States, because they don't want to antagonize Putin and Russia. Because of, as we talked about, maybe this goes into our last segment, why do we care? Who cares if Russia's unstable?
Well, that goes back to your nuclear weapons thing, though.
Well, and also economics, and also for the Western allies in NATO, because we know that going into last winter with the war being fought, there was all what's going to happen to the price of oil, and how are the European countries going to get through winter. And then, there's all that fight over who could buy Russian oil, how much Russian oil would be sold for on the world market. And then luckily winter wasn't too bad in Europe, and so they made it through. Okay, we've got those same issues coming up now. What happens if there's instability in Russia, or some nuclear weapons go off and oil supplies aren't available? Who picks up the slack? How does that affect the United States? How does that help China? How does that help the Middle East? Oh, you mean there's still terrorist groups in the Middle East? All of a sudden, what happens if oil prices double and they make more money?
You're sounding like our old buddy there. The conspiracy theories running rampant.
I'm just saying, that's why you see so many people interested in this, even if, quote, nothing else comes of it.
Well, back to that.
What could it lead to?
Back to the article that we mentioned at the beginning of this segment. Putin has long embraced chaos, and now it's enveloping him. Part of what's taken accurately from that title is chaos can be a great tool, but is there a time where can you control it forever? So yeah, maybe Putin is the guy that, arranged all this and wanted it to go this way and blah, blah. But now has he started, is it this snowball rolling down the hill that you can't stop now? It's picking up speed and it's getting bigger, and you can tell it to go a certain direction, but that doesn't mean it will. Because maybe it's actually too unruly for you to control. And maybe you can kind of control it, right? Like, you can't set it on its direct path, but you can kind of give it 3 options to go toward, but that doesn't mean that we like any of the 3 options either. I think the philosophy approach about kind of what's next is part of what we have to talk about, because you do have the NATO summit coming up. You've got, that meeting happening. You've got, again, Belarus here in the middle of stuff with, Russia, because that's what they do. And their next door neighbors, remember, folks, to Ukraine, they share the northern border, where it's their southern border with Ukraine's northern border, a large portion of it. To Lance's point, there's a lot of different things going on. How does all of this change, or should it change, the United States calculation and our involvement in the region? Let's find out. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. So, Lance, we've been covering this now for over a year, everything that's going on in Ukraine. And back before Russia, decided to invade and start this war, I think that you and I were on the record as saying it's time to step in and stop this and draw a line in the sand. And we didn't do that, obviously, and here's where we are now. I've restated a few times, that I think a more active role is required, as in, there was an opportunity for a no-fly zone. I don't know how realistic that is now, but to, admit them into NATO with stipulations and, tell Russia you got freaking, 72 hours to get everybody out of here. And if you're still in here, then that would be, you've declared war against NATO. Is it risky now? If, for example, is that too much? If we did that right now, does that push Putin over the edge? Because he's got this rebellion that he's dealing with. There's questions about how he can continue the war anyway. Or is it the perfect time to, press down and say,
everything. Yeah, I think we'll do everything within our power to do what we can to cause Putin problems without it coming directly from us. How's that?
Is that what we should be doing? That's what I want to know. I agree with you. I think that's what we'll do too. But you're the man in charge. Do we stay with this action or do we switch to a more active role? Like we've discussed
I'm not going to
before?
change my mind. I think go back and listen, folks, to the shows, but I'm going to stand by the fact that when this all started, I said we need to take Putin out. So I don't think this changes my stance at all. I'm for we've got to get rid of Vladimir Putin if we want to get some control and stability in Russia and get them to play ball in Europe to help the world economy against the Chinese. I'm going to bring in, I'm going to roll the dice
just
on you.
Just going to throw even more.
But I think this is the perfect opportunity to get a more U.S.-led friend in Russia to help us with some of the things that we want to do in this region. And I think if we don't do it, it's a missed opportunity because otherwise, one of these days Putin's going to be gone. Just, nature will take over. For our older listeners, how it goes in the old Soviet Union. A premier might be dead for 3 or 4 months before there was a new one. But at some point, Putin will be dead of natural causes and there'll be new leadership in Russia. Do we want it to be Putin's handpicked people? Or do we want it to be some, or do we want to do it now and get in there? I think we should do it now. You asked me my opinion. I think we should do it now. We should change our policy. We should put Ukraine in NATO. We should support Ukraine. We should get Russia out of Ukraine. And then as much as we can control the players in Russia to oust Putin as the president and let the Russian people pick a new leader. Now, am I risking some things? Yes, but you risk some things by not doing anything either. So, because now
there's plenty of risk with what we've already done.
Exactly. And if Putin is able to consolidate his power at this point and start to now all of a sudden get his ducks in a row and get his allies behind him, then what does that say for the Russian future over the next 30 years? And how much will they play ball with the United States? And how much will they go to start playing ball with China? I mean, here's a real, it's always been the thing is Russia and China have never gotten along. Throughout the whole Cold War, the only thing the United States could really count on was that Russia and China weren't going to go together. And it seems like now that's closer and closer, whether that's a ploy by both Russia and China, but it seems like that's a possibility. And if you're the United States, you can't let that happen. We as the United States cannot take on China and Russia at the same time, even a broken down Russia. I know Russia's not the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union and the communist Chinese would never even sit down and talk to one another.
It's the give an inch, take a mile thing. We were up in arms on this program, and this shows how long we've been doing this, when Putin took Crimea, and we said, this will not be the end. You can't let him do this, and basically do it with impunity. And we were very critical of President Obama's response and the United States response at that time, which I still believe was, I don't think I believe, I think there is evidence today now that it was wholly inadequate, because if it had been adequate, we wouldn't have this right now. I mean, that's the, you know what I mean? That's
you wouldn't have invaded Ukraine.
Right. You wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if you had been properly beaten back when you attempted and then not just attempted, folks. Remember, it wasn't an attempt and a failed. It was attempted and succeeded at stealing Crimea. So what did we think was going to happen? There was going to come a day where, Crimea was small potatoes. Most people didn't even know how to say the name. So who cares about Crimea?
Where is it?
Right. Where is it? Do we really? But okay, all that's done and over. We got it. They slapped our wrist and they hate it, but whatever, it's ours. So why don't we go for something bigger? A country with 30 million people in it or so. That seems like we could do that. Crimea was small, and this is.
Well, they're not going to do anything because they're afraid of what it might, nuclear war or whatever. Right. So, and again, that allows Putin, the ex-KGB agent, to start to reunify the old Soviet Union, which is what he grew up with. Right. That's what he's most comfortable with.
Right.
That's what he would like to see happen. That's his ultimate goal.
So from the beginning, I guess, I don't know, that's back to, you can't let Russia take Ukraine. And you might say, well, why? Because it doesn't matter to us. It matters because it doesn't stop there. To Lance's point about, if they get that done, there's also this whole side of, does China start to believe in maybe some of this philosophy that Russia's taken, and not only does it raise questions about what China may want, right? Like getting Taiwan reunified, but
crack down in Hong Kong,
but
maybe go in and take Korea.
Right. Do they decide that maybe we have more common ground with Russia than we realized, and also, even though we don't really like the Russians very well, if we could get along, we'd be pretty hard to stop, because, they obviously can get away with this stuff. And we control so many economic levers. If we paired up, we could probably get a few of these things done that we've wanted to do that the U.S. and its allies have kept us from doing.
Either we're going to remain the leader of the free world or we're not. And you have to take a stance. And we have been very mealy-mouthed about, let's not talk about, yes, the two Democratic presidents that aren't stepping in, but then you had the Republican President Trump, who seemed to be Putin's best friend. Putin campaigned for Trump to win. How good was that? How much power did Putin think he had when Donald Trump was going around saying what a great person Vladimir Putin was, and I really wish I could be president forever? We haven't had anybody stand up to Putin in a long, long time.
Yep.
And okay, 25 years later almost now, here's where we are. Where has it gotten us? You say, well, at least there's no nuclear war and we're not all enough. Okay, do you want to die a slow death or do you want to die a quick death? And or stop a crazy man from being in charge of things. Right? Because there's always that people say, well, you're either going to die slowly, or you're going to die quickly. Or maybe we don't die at all because we get the crazy man out of the Kremlin and put a more common sense thinking leader.
People have already died, right? Not discount the fact that lots of Ukrainians and lots of Russians have already died. We have already spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on this. And do I want to lose?
And U.S. troops are already in the area,
right,
supporting the Ukrainians anyway.
Do I want to lose a U.S. troop in this conflict? Of course not. I don't think none of us want that. But if the difference is between we're going to lose, 1,000 today or 10,000 tomorrow, isn't that an easy? Yeah, it's awful. Okay, we're gonna lose people. Yes, that's terrible. And I have family in the military, so I'm very sensitive to that. Like, absolutely. But there is some degree of calculation here on how far do you let it go before it becomes so bad that now we can't measure the losses in tens of thousands because that won't be adequate to capture the picture of what's going to be required to stop it. And I'm not putting this all on the president, because remember, folks, that, Congress could, choose to, I don't know, do something, but they don't do that. So, I mean, there's that too, right? It's not all on President Biden, nor is it all on Congress. It's our government kind of sitting there being like, well, we kind of want to help, but we kind of don't. We don't want to make Putin too mad. And it's like, well, we're underwriting the war. He's not an idiot. He knows we're doing that. I mean, I guess we can make him more mad by drawing the line in the sand, but isn't he smart enough to know that that's coming at some point? I mean, hasn't he just been buying time, hoping that maybe he'll get a resolution before we decide to do that?
Well, let's face it. If he can't even defeat the Ukrainians with NATO's support, what happens if NATO troops go in?
Right.
There's no way he's got to get out, right? I mean, or do something really stupid,
or
right?
do something really, and that's the whole thing of we're all playing to that thing of we don't know. I don't know Putin. Lance doesn't know Putin. None of us really know him. We really don't know. He might not know what he's going to do if he's put in that corner, I would hope that if there's a piece of him that, has some degree of preservation of his country, that he would know in that situation that using a nuke is just the end, because it just would be. It would mean total annihilation, of everything that Russia once was and will never be again because of that action. But again, people don't necessarily follow logic when you're in those tough situations. And I am sympathetic to understanding that we just don't know how he'll react. But I don't think us not knowing how he will react should prevent us from acting.
Should predicate what we do.
That's right. There's still people dying who want a democracy, who are fighting for it. We can't take the stance that we're taking and profess to be for freedom and democracy if we're not willing to stand up when somebody says they need our help, So why we do this show today, Lance? There was a reason.
There is a reason. There's always a reason. And the reason is always the same. That is that True Chat, who we work for, has a mission. And that mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's show. You tell your coworkers and your family and friends, and they say, well, that sounds like something I'd like to listen to. Tell them as a podcast. They can find The State of Us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us releases new episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning as a podcast. Those same episodes are heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to Associate Recording Producer Levi LaForge and Senior Producer Bradley Butch. And of course, thank you, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.